In 1993, Nelson Mandela said, "Human rights will be the light that guides our foreign affairs." He was speaking in recognition of all the countries that had supported the struggle against apartheid. But then reality hit. The South African government wants to trade with the rest of Africa, where gay rights, LGBTI rights are under threat. We want to trade with China, with Russia and India, where civil society is restricted. And one of our biggest trading partners is the USA, where at times it seems Black lives don't matter. So is it unrealistic for South Africa to try and be a beacon of morality in an immoral world? With us to discuss this are Ambassador Mxolisi Nkosi, the COO of the Department of International Relations, Patrick Bond, Professor of Political Economy at WITS, Fatima Shabodin from Action Aid, Dawn Kavanagh of the Coalition of African Lesbians, Chris Landsberg, Professor of Politics at UJ, and Victor Khomweswana, African business specialist and talk radio host. And in our audience, we have LGBTI activists, civil society groups, and communities all concerned about our commitment to human rights at home and abroad. Welcome to you all. And you at home can have your say on Facebook or on Twitter. But before we start, take a look at this.
South Africa strives to have good relations with its African neighbours. We have also chosen to be part of a new alliance with Brazil, Russia, India and China known as BRICS. But does maintaining these international relationships mean compromising our commitment to human rights? The rainbow flag, a symbol of pride and solidarity. These are gay and lesbian people in Uganda. They are risking their lives. Across most of Africa, gay and lesbian people are persecuted, their sexuality criminalized, subject to punishment, even death. To escape, many seek refuge in South Africa. Dumisani Dube is a gay man. He fled to South Africa from neighboring Zimbabwe, fearing for his and his family's safety. Here, he can practice his religion, live as an openly gay man, and do the advocacy work he loves.
It is very difficult to be a gay man in Zimbabwe, knowing that my president has always said that gays and lesbians are worse than pigs and dogs. And as an activist, it could be even more dangerous and affect the family. But being here in South Africa, I am much safer, and I know that my family is much safer.
South Africa's constitution guarantees gay and lesbian rights, but the government has recently come under fire for its voting patterns at the United Nations. In June 2016, South Africa and several African countries failed to support the establishment of an international watchdog on gay rights. Activists like Dumisani think South Africa is prioritizing African solidarity instead of its own constitution.
It sent quite a skewed message to the rest of the African countries, because South Africa has got a progressive constitution that is pro-LGBTI.
South Africa also failed to back a UN declaration in favor of human rights defenders. We also tried to weaken a resolution protecting freedom of expression on the internet. Critics see these actions as an attempt to cozy up to BRICS partners. While South Africa defends BRICS as a strategic opportunity to trade with southern countries, activists in Brazil, Russia, India and China say their human rights are under attack. While trade within the bloc has increased, so has inequality between the rich and the poor in each nation. In India, Russia and China, human rights are under attack.
Speaking of Russia, for example, the human rights record is extremely poor. Human rights organizations are literally suffocating in a very repressive authoritarian context.
The BRICS group is also seen as benefiting a small political and business elite. Activists argue benefits have not reached the poor.
When we say that it is only those in power and their cronies and those who have been in power and so already have one foot up the economic ladder from everyone else, when we behave in those ways, we are discarding the human rights of the vast majority of our population.
Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir attending an AU summit in South Africa in June 2015. Yet another display of questionable foreign policy. He's wanted by the International Criminal Court to answer for human rights abuses and genocide in Darfur. As a member of the ICC, South Africa was obliged to arrest him. When it didn't, the South African Litigation Centre took the government to court. After losing in 2 lower courts, government has appealed to the Constitutional Court.
This case has actually brought to the fore inconsistencies as far as South Africa's priorities. The law on this is very clear. South Africa made the Rome Statute of the ICC domestic law in this country, and South Africa had a duty at the domestic level and at the international level to have President Omar al-Bashir arrested, and they failed to do that. And so now, of course, we question the South African government's priorities, and we question where South African foreign policy is headed.
Being clear on foreign policy and human rights is important for Dumasani. He needs to know our government will champion the protection of vulnerable communities.
Most of the African countries are so homophobic, and that they are persecuting, they are arresting, they are killing, they are condemning the LGBTQ community. And most of them have nowhere to run but to run to South Africa. So this is a matter of importance.
Ambassador, why have we compromised our principles? I mean, is it to keep our trading partners happy? Because when it comes to LGBTI rights, in countries like Sudan, in countries like northern Nigeria, Somalia, homosexuality is punishable by death. So why don't we just cut off all ties with these countries, sanction them?
South Africa remains committed to the pursuit of human rights. Human rights remains a major pillar of our foreign policy. And indeed, we have consistently displayed this commitment to human rights by championing, defending, and advocating for the development of international norms and standards for the protection of human rights, both in New York at the UN, as well as in Addis Ababa.
That's not entirely true, Ambassador, if I may just interject. I mean, very recently, South Africa is the very country that abstained its vote when it came to the issue of appointing an international watchdog on LGBTI issues.
Well, I must contextualize the recent vote on the LGBTI issue by saying that, firstly, South Africa fully supports that resolution. We endorse the letter and the spirit of that resolution because it is in keeping both with the UN Declaration on Human Rights as well as with our own constitution.
But we didn't vote for it,
and
Ambassador.
Particularly the provisions that relate to the protection of the LGBTI community. There was indeed there were some technical issues between us and the delegation in Geneva that was negotiating this resolution. And I would like to affirm our support fully, without any reservation, for that resolution, and to indicate that if that resolution were to be presented right here and now today, we would fully vote for that resolution.
It was presented at the UN and we abstained. I'm just saying. Dawn, are you happy with that?
No, we're not. I think it's worrying to hear from the ambassador that there are technical difficulties related to the vote because there was more than sufficient time to prepare for the vote. Coalition of African Lesbians and a number of other South African organizations met with DIRCO, presented a set of ideas about what we would like to see in the resolution, what would help to shift the current violence and discrimination faced by LGBTI people. So, you know, even if for some reason they didn't know about it, they were told. They were given the information. They didn't have access to the resolution, the draft. We made that available.
And
so,
as a matter of fact, it was South Africa, it was Saudi Arabia, it was other African countries that didn't support the vote. What advice do you give in that regard, Mxolisi? Because what you're saying and what is actually happening are two completely different things.
Well, as I'm saying, I'm articulating the official position of the South African government on this issue, and would like to reaffirm our commitment to human rights and the protection of the rights of the LGBTI community.
All right, we'll revisit this particular issue a bit later on in the show, but Patrick, I'd like to just bring you in here. What about the argument that the LGBTI community is a minority, and surely if we had to stand for our principles, we'd have no one to trade with?
Well, listen, this is just one example, a very critical one, of a general tendency. I think the 4 words describe it well: talk left, walk right. And this is also true with some of the other cases you brought up, which also minority groups, people who are fighting for justice, for human rights, who are being oppressed partly because South Africa votes with oppressive regimes. But it's the big picture items. It's the trade deals. That's not DIRCO, that's Department of Trade and Industry. It's the Treasury and the Reserve Bank that relate to the International Monetary Fund to repress the majorities in the world. It's oil deals, it's arms deals. It's one after the other where it's gazing upwards to power, Ambassador, puts you and your department in league with very evil forces that fight poor people and their rights. Contrast that, say, with Fidel Castro, just turned 90. He would gaze down to the ANC and give it support. He would gaze to social movements and progressives around the world and find ways to empower people who are fighting for justice.
All right, Chris, I'd like to bring you in here. I mean, do you agree? Does it feel to you as though we're doing everything we can to keep the powers that be happy?
So this is the big debate, and I think the debate should start very early. I think reality is a bit more complex. To say that South Africa is either in wholesale fashion voting with repressive regimes, always against human rights, never in favor, I think it's simplistic to say the least. On the other hand, South Africa has, since 1994, particularly because it wanted to show that it is unlike its predecessor apartheid regime, South Africa was daring enough to elevate human rights to almost the fulcrum of its foreign policy. And even the much vaunted article that you cited earlier, where President Mandela, when he was still ANC leader, declared human rights as the light that will guide our foreign policy.
Sure.
And we will canonize human rights.
Yeah.
Even President Mandela, 1 month after coming into office, we sent arms to Rwanda, and we saw the most horrific genocide playing out in the 20th century, other than, of course, the Holocaust. And even President Mandela's record on this issue is not clean. So this iconization of our foreign policy and the idea that the Mandela administration was squeaky clean on human rights, and his successors, Thabo Mbeki in particular, the 7 months of Motlanthe, now Jacob Zuma, they are anti-human rights. Reality is a bit more complex. So here's the point in a nutshell.
Sure.
South Africa's foreign policy is a trade-off and a tension between moralistic values, including these values that we're debating today, and the issue of trade that you've mentioned, the issue of solidarism with those that helped it to attain liberation, South-South, etc.
Sure. I'll go one step further and actually just bring in another issue here. It's the big elephant in the room. So our newest trading partners, Russia, India, China, are countries that are known for their complete disregard for human rights, and yet we are in business with them. Victor, I mean, just help me out here for a second.
Now, the BRICS story is very problematic for me because it's a coalition of nations that are never really ever going to be able to stand toe to toe. South Africa is way too small. It might be the gateway, but it's not the only gateway to the continent, because Kenya is asserting itself in the east, Nigeria is asserting itself in the west. So it's no longer as big a deal as it used to be when it was South Africa, the South Africa. So I'm sure that the reality will always be otherwise, as Prof. Lynsberg is saying. And I would wish to be able to vote on every issue the way the letter of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights says. But I'm saying to you, The reality of people who negotiate trade deals, especially in a coalition of unequals, will always find us backing down when we could be assertive.
So Fatima, do you accept the fact that, you know, it's a trade-off? We have to sacrifice or compromise some things in order to be able to trade and to look at the bigger picture overall?
Well, I agree with Professor Landsberg that the reality is complex, but we cannot negotiate around our constitutional principles. We fought for this constitution and people died for this Bill of Rights. And that applies to us whether we're inside the borders of South Africa or outside of it. And the problem with what's happening is that South African citizens are surprised when we switch on the radio in the morning to hear how we voted at the UN or the decisions we've made in Addis. We're not privy to the rationale. We keep being patronized and told that these things are too complex for us to understand. But the reality is in the context of globalizations, these things have consequences for us as South Africans. So we cannot be told by a government that these things are too sophisticated for you as ordinary South Africans to understand. It's not acceptable.
All right. Ambassador, I'll give you an opportunity to respond. So when we come back, some music from a young star who you hear on the radio in South Africa every day, but you probably didn't know hails from Zimbabwe. Intrigued? Stick around.
Pagama Africa, Pagama, Pagama, Pagama Africa. Ooh. Ooh. Too many times you've been victimized and utilized. They've taken your riches away, filled you with poverty and diseases. They say you're not worth enough. Easy, sasaguti siya ila. Masiba maneni zada. Wangu muntu. Pagama Africa. Pagama. Pagama, Pagama Africa. Ooh, Pagama Africa.
Thank you. Welcome back to the big debate on international relations and human rights. And we just heard from Berita, a musician who hails from Zimbabwe, who sang a song about poverty in Africa and the need for unity. That was beautiful, Berita.
Thank you so much.
I have to say, I didn't know that are you from Zimbabwe? Or are you partly Zimbabwean?
So originally, I was born and raised in Zimbabwe by Zimbabwean parents. I moved to the Eastern Cape in 2011 to study. I now have self-made family in the Eastern Cape, and I consider myself a Eastern Cape adopted.
So how do you feel when you see stories like the story that we saw of Dumisani Dube, who had to flee his country because of his sexuality?
Yes. Well, as a woman and as a young woman, I'm still looking at the world and figuring it out. But one thing that I'm not about discrimination in any form. I believe that all human beings are equal. It has nothing to do with your race. It has nothing to do with your sexuality. It has nothing to do with your disability. We are all equal.
Thank you very much, Berita. Round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. All right, now let's talk with some gay rights activists from neighboring countries. Dumisani Dube came to South Africa to get away from the persecution of gay and lesbian people in Zimbabwe, and he's the person that we saw in our film clip. Dumisani, thank you so much for being here today. So first and foremost, since coming to South Africa, have you felt any safer as a gay man here?
Well, I should say yes, I felt safer, but There are things that have made me so unstable in my staying in South Africa. My fear was on xenophobia attacks. So it was a double attack and a double fear for me as a gay person and as a foreigner.
How do you feel about the issue of South Africa in particular abstaining from the vote of having an LGBTI watchdog?
When I heard that, I had to refer to my Bible, and my Bible says that it's either you are hot or cold. You cannot be lukewarm. So when South Africa abstained, I really felt disappointed because, as I said earlier on in the script there, that it sent a skewed message to the rest of the African countries, just like my own country, Zimbabwe, because it is a country that is known to be very homophobic, especially when it comes from our president, who has described us as worse than pigs and dogs.
Thank you very much, Dumsani. Round of applause for Dumsani, ladies and gentlemen. So, Ambassador, you know, one of the reasons that were cited for South Africa abstaining from the vote is the issue of not wanting to have this interference with our national sovereignty. But surely you can understand the fears of the LGBTI community. It feels as though we're going back on our commitment to LGBTI rights.
Actually, it's the opposite. It's the contrary. We're moving forward insofar as the issue of the advancement and the protection of LGBTI rights. We are advocating the promotion of these rights within the framework of the international system and also within the framework of the African continent. And let me just, while I have the floor, come back to a discussion that you had earlier before the break, that actually, in our view, there is no dichotomy between the pursuit of our values and our interests. In trade agreements, we do not trade between values and interests. We do not trade values for interests. We trade tradable goods. Values do not figure in trade agreements. It's purely tradable goods. So we must not confuse our engagement, our interaction with BRICS countries, China, India, Brazil, for a forum that trades on values. Everybody trades with China. China is the second biggest economy in the world.
Doesn't make it right, though. That everybody trades with China
No,
doesn't
I'm saying
make it right.
China, the reason why everybody trades with China is because China is the second biggest economy in the world. China is the biggest manufacturer of goods. So you can't not trade with China.
So what about the vote on human rights defenders? We abstain from that as well. Patrick, I'd like to bring you in here.
Yes, I mean, I would love to hear the ambassador say...
Are we confused?
Well, I'd love to hear a more proactive statement, not just voting on a UN resolution, but would you in future withdraw ambassadors like John Kalani from Uganda, a homophobe, who upset the local gay activists, but also contributed to the life-threatening conditions they face. I mean, there's so many areas where if you say trade makes it worthwhile, denying the Dalai Lama a visa is another example. We have to respect Beijing on that. Is that the line that we had? Those deals don't help South Africans who are being swamped by cheap Chinese products. The steel industry is a good example where trade is undermining. We've actually been seeing the closure of the second largest steel plant this year, Everest Highveld, and probably the biggest. ArcelorMittal will close many foundries because of this swamping. Same with the free trade deals with the EU and the US. Now you say you can't do much about that. Well, actually you can. You can begin to put on the barriers. And one barrier traditionally is if your country has bad human rights, well, we're going to make trade more difficult. Would you not consider promoting that line of argument?
Well, in the context of international trade, you always have to make compromises in the nature of negotiations. You do not get into any negotiation with an idea that you are going to put maximalist positions and expect that you are going to achieve everything that you are putting across. So it's give and take, but we try as much as possible in these negotiations to serve the best interest of South Africa and to make sure that we protect our own domestic industries.
Sure. What about the issue of Omar al-Bashir? That's something we could have done. We could have arrested him the minute he set foot in this country.
So we took the decision that we took based on the fact that President al-Bashir was the guest of the African Union, which was hosting a summit here in South Africa. He had a legitimate invitation that was extended to him. He is a serving president of one of the countries, a sovereign state of Africa. Yes, there's an issue that is pending between him and the ICC.
He's been accused of genocide.
But we need to separate these issues. The fact that he had to come here as a guest of the African Union, which had declared the venue of the hosting of that summit as an inviolable territory in terms of immunities and privileges, and therefore enjoyed those immunities and privileges, including immunity from prosecution.
All right.
Masichabi, I want to challenge you on your preoccupation with China. As we're sitting here, our main trading partner is the EU. We know what they're doing to refugees in Europe. So if we're going to have this argument, we're going to have to be consistent. I think we should have arrested al-Bashir, but we also should have done the same to Tony Blair, who is a war criminal, we know that. We're very excited to welcome President Obama here. While Guantanamo Bay is still open, while they're killing black men and women on the streets of the USA. We haven't recalled the US ambassadors. Pretoria hasn't summoned the US ambassador to come and account to what they're doing to black people in the USA. So I think we must be consistent about this. Don't be distracted by China and Russia, because that's another agenda. If we're going to say human rights informs our international relations, it's not about those who threaten the interests of the existing forces that rule the world. It's about our principles and carrying it consistently into the world.
Thank you.
Let me just piggyback on to Fatima's point, because I think this is a very important point. You see, I'm not in a popularity contest, right? To come across pro-human rights and think that the world goes around by states making human rights the apex of their priorities. The nuclear deal, there is a huge controversy at the moment, right? And apparently it involves the Guptas, ministers have been placed there to try and secure it. Every time we hear about the nuclear deal, Russia is being thrown in our face. Are you aware of the fact that South Korea is tendering for that process? France is tendering for that process. And never shall we hear about the Western countries. So what we've done, we've now equated human rights with Western states and the values that and yet they commit, and yet they commit unimaginable atrocities in the world. So here for me is the real debate. So Professor Bond introduced, rightly so, the idea of the excruciating levels of poverty and inequality in this country. The ambassador says, in order to reduce that and make inroads into that, we need to trade. Yet just because we need to trade doesn't mean that the nature of the trade agreements that we enter into are progressive trade agreements. It may very well exacerbate these things. But here's the final point I'd like to make. And I know I'm going to disappoint some in the audience here today. Human rights for me is not the #1 priority in our foreign policy. And I know the ambassador might disagree with me on this. It is not. The #1 priority in South Africa's foreign policy, South Africa never shuts the door on the prospect for negotiations. Whether it's on the gay rights legislation and vote, whether it's on Myanmar, on Iran, Iraq, Zimbabwe, and so the list goes on. The one consistency in South Africa's foreign policy, it never shuts the door on the prospect for negotiations, even with al-Bashir. And you know what it means? Human rights sometimes play second fiddle in our foreign policy, and it's about time that government admits that, so that we can move on with this debate. Because we're going to sit here hoping government to play this moralistic game in foreign policy, and we're going to be disappointed. It's not going to happen.
All right. So now, the question becomes, how do we bring ordinary people, civil society, into shaping foreign policy? I'll come to you, sir. Please stand up for us.
There's a kind of misconception here that the type of values that South Africa embodies within its constitution are Western norms. That is a misconception, a big misconception. In fact, under Western domination on the continent, where did we see those values taking place? When the UN Charter came about, Most of parts of Africa were still under colonial rule. So the values that are in our constitution are our values. We own those values. They come from struggle, those values. Nobody understands discrimination like South Africans understand it. We are the last racial dictatorship in the world. We understand the importance of tolerance. But the reality is, you said that in your opening speech, the reality, how do you transfer your moral authority in an immoral world? The reality is that South Africa cannot influence the way China governs its own citizens. But what this debate shows is the importance of involving a wider group in foreign policy. And I think what this shows is that moving forward in terms of South Africa's foreign policy, it will be important to create those platforms where more civil society can be involved, where the ministries can explain the complexities of foreign policy and not make it seem as though they're too complex for ordinary people to understand.
Thank you very much. Dawn?
The complexity question, I think as South Africans, we must recognize complexity. I think where DIRCO has to rise to the occasion is what we observe is instrumentalizing the civil and political rights in order to advance social, economic, and cultural rights. And that cannot continue. For the June session of the Human Rights Council, we're focusing on the resolution on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, but there was another resolution on civil society space where Russia led a number of hostile amendments to what was a progressive piece of work done by a number of 5 states, I think. And South Africa at some point was joining Russia in eroding or the possibility of eroding civil society space. And at the same time, South Africa was making an announcement about starting to regulate foreign funding. What does that mean? We have to halt using one set of rights to achieve another, because in the end, the same economic rights are going to be eroded in the way that we are eroding civil and political rights.
All right, thank you very much for that. When we come back, we ask how people can be involved in foreign policy. You're watching The Big Debate. Welcome back to The Big Debate. I'm Masachaba Ndlovu. Is there a way for civil society and government in South Africa to help push for a human rights culture in international relations? Now, I know that a few of you in the audience had said that we should just be very careful of not making it about Russia, making it about China. However, a Russian activist was in the country a few days ago, and I think that we should probably all hear what she has to say.
Russia tries to play a lessons-giving role and explain the others how to respect the human rights. We see its interventions in Syria, we see it in Ukraine, we see it in Europe. What the world should know, including South Africa, is that within last 3 years, more than 30 repressive laws, authoritarian laws, were adopted, which makes practically impossible to enjoy the freedoms, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. One can go to jail for participating in a peaceful demonstration, even if there were only 3 persons.
Now, Ambassador, as a member of BRICS, firstly, should we not be concerned with the human rights injustices happening in Russia? And is there anything we can do to clamp down on this oppression?
Well, I'm not aware of the particular circumstances that have just been reported in the clip. We engage with Russia as we engage with everybody else on interstate issues. We do not discuss sovereign domestic matters.
It's in the public domain, Ambassador.
We engage. As I say, we do not engage on sovereign domestic matters. We engage on interstate relations. We engage on how we can help each other to improve our economies, how we can use each other's advantages. For instance, Russia has got a very advanced science technology landscape, how we can leverage that to develop our own science and technology landscape. We engage on how we can trade, how we can use each other's strength in the multilateral system.
I'd like to just
act as
interject
agents
there for a second.
for change.
Sure. I'd like you to think about this for a second, and maybe we can all just sort of mellow on it. If other countries had said that we don't want to get involved in South Africa's internal affairs during the height of apartheid, where would we be?
Well, you must remember that apartheid was declared as a crime against humanity. There was a whole groundswell of international activism, international action by the United Nations to push for sanctions against the apartheid regime. This was a global matter. It was an international matter. So I don't think you can equate these questions.
All right. Victor, are we not focused on a system that basically empowers business elites and compromises the people?
Well, I'm sure people would like business to do well because that's where they get jobs, that's where you generate. In fact, even the human rights discussion, if you deny people the right to earn a living, to generate income, to start business and operate them, would be irrelevant. Because, I mean, what's the point of having the right to live if you can't afford the basics? Or what's the right of sexual orientation if you are not entitled to earn a living where you wanted to? So, and this discussion perhaps, rather than the BRICS, should be about whether Africa is empowering itself to look out for its own interests. Because we already, when I look at the African Union, I wouldn't say so. Again, we speak very well about what needs to be done. But I'm saying if China can make a contribution to building the headquarters of the African Union, when there are 54 African states, okay, not all of the members of the African Union, that says something. Almost is as if the Russians, the Chinese, the French, the British, the Americans dictate what happens on the African continent more than we do.
All right.
What do I mean by that?
Sure, go ahead.
Maybe not related to this. The Electrify Africa Act was an act of the American government. The AGOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act, was an act of the American government. I'm saying to you, perhaps the discussion should also be whether Africa, amongst its own member states, is doing enough to empower itself in areas that matter so that human rights are a lot easier to prioritize. Because I suspect you're going to struggle. Professor Landsberg said it. Ambassador Nkosi said it. Everybody agrees that if you are not are able to look after your own interests, starting with those things that matter, whether you can day-to-day protect shelter, provide shelter for yourself, be able to educate yourself, chances are the human rights discussion is not going to even get a chance to be.
All right. So, Patrick, are we not then hampering Africa's progress with all these ideologies around human rights?
Not at all. We're seeing Africa blocked in its development, social, human, political, all of our aspects of development by repressive regimes, often empowered by the West, which corporations take profits, and now often by BRICS countries. And the result is more protest in Africa than ever before. And the measurements you find in the African Development Bank's annual African Economic Outlook, the number of protests are going through the roof. 2011, North Africa, they started, but they've really kept up. I mean, amazing protests against the Nigerian government and the IMF for doubling the oil price, for a Senegalese president, Wade, who wanted to stay a third term, all over the continent. And why is the South African government feeling humble about not expressing some solidarity with Africans who are oppressed?
All right. When we return, a final word from our audience. You're watching The Big Debate. Welcome back to The Big Debate on international relations and human rights. Does South Africa put human rights on the back burner to please our friends and our trading partners globally? What do you think?
In a brief summary, what we're trying to say is that, directed to the ambassador, like let's have a foreign policy that is prioritizing our national interests, not a foreign policy that is for sale and narrow, that is prioritizing the elites. Like I was checking the issue of the FDI. Where is that money going? Instead, it's going to the big corporations that are in the GSE and is sitting there. It's not going to the people.
I've heard that we had a fruitful debate today, but my worry is the public participation. Because in everything that the government is doing globally, not only in South Africa, is not including the public. So hence we're having this debate today, confusing us. But if you can have that public participation everywhere globally, activists won't be protesting in the streets. Because activists, we're fighting today, we want what is right for our people. Thank you.
Whatever that we do in this country should be to protect the interests of Africa as a continent. I feel that the LGBTI persons are the interests of the continent, and I feel that our rights are not protected at all. We are the interests. So us being the interests, I feel that nothing is done for us. Well, a little, they say that a little is done, but I see nothing being done for us.
If you look at how to develop trade and how to develop opportunities for people in South Africa, you would have to bring in trade, you have to bring investors into the country. Yes, I realize the fact that you have socio-economic rights to pursue, but also other civil political rights are of importance in this case. And we must commend the government of South Africa for what it has done for the past years.
My comment is directed to the ambassador. You said something about China being the second biggest economy in the world. So South Africa can not afford to stop doing business with China because of that. What I hear when you say a statement like that is like your daughter coming to you and telling you that she is in an abusive marriage and you telling her to stay in the marriage because the husband is providing for her. The husband is doing everything for her and she cannot afford. Well, child. That's all I hear. We all know where China stands as far as LGBTI rights are concerned. You cannot be lukewarm. It's either you're hot or you're cold. So it's like we are trying to stay lukewarm so that when somebody who is pro-gay rights comes, someone who's pro-LGBTI rights comes, then we fit in, we can blend in.
So after the break, closing comments from our panel. Welcome back to the big debate. I'm Masachaba Ndlovu. So let's hear it from our panel. Victor.
Put South Africa first. The interests of South Africans, put the interests of Africa first, because that's what China is going to do, that's what Russia is going to do, that's what America is going to do. Every country is going to look after its own interests. So all these discussions will do a lot better if we brought in the interests of our people and listened to them. That's the thread that's coming. And as for LGBTI rights, I don't think we know enough about it. We are not informed enough to make good decisions. So far, it's up to us to inform ourselves a lot more.
Thank you. Chris.
The world has moved on from 1648, when sovereignty was declared as the be-all and end-all of international relations. You don't have a world anymore where it's all about the interests of elites and powerful governments. The sovereignty of people will ultimately come to the fore and they'll make themselves heard. South Africa is becoming a very timid player in international relations. It is not true that South Africa cannot influence Russia, China, or America. This country, more than many African states because of its size, its importance, enjoys an agency and a voice that it simply does not use to speak. I don't think China would have objected to South Africa making the case for the Dalai Lama. And as for our non-ideological foreign policy ambassador, that ANC foreign policy discussion document of last year is so ideological that we almost speak for Russia and China and offer our sovereignty to them and say, we'll do the bidding for you. South Africa must become a bit more of a respected player in world affairs like we used to be.
Thank you.
The false dichotomy of putting human rights on one side and strategic interests on another doesn't hold in real life. It is in our strategic interest to create a world, a region in which human rights is respected. That's the best way to grow our economy, to grow our world. So this, the repeated argument that's given that we can't look at LGBTI rights because there are other strategic priorities, we cannot indulge that anymore.
Thank you.
The second thing I want to say is the way Dirko is engaging around foreign policy formulation is problematic. At the moment, if you've got money to get yourself to Pretoria or to New York, if you can speak English, if you can write English, then your voice is heard, possibly. But poor people in this country for whom foreign policy decisions have consequences every day do not have a voice in that process. So Dirko's got to seriously look at how it does it and create an enabling mechanism for ordinary South Africans to have a voice, because we hear that we're increasing trade with China. Go out into the streets, ask South Africans if they feel that increased trade with China has made our lives better. You know, because there's a certain rationale that informs these policy decisions that doesn't connect with the voices of ordinary South Africans.
Thank you. Dawn.
South Africa, like any state, needs to take leadership in foreign policy in intergovernmental spaces. And to do that with integrity, South Africa has to ensure, number one, transparency, and number two, meaningful participation.
Thank you. Patrick.
Master Shaba, you started with Nelson Mandela's appeal for human rights in foreign policy in 1993. Do you remember 2003, 10 years later, ex-President Mandela said something very profound just as George W. Bush and Tony Blair were invading Iraq. George Bush doesn't have a brain, he said. But the next month, Denel and Dirko approved, sold hundreds of millions of rands of weapons to the Gulf War, to the Iraq War belligerents. Do you feel with this talk left, walk right tendency, the contortions that everyone has remarked upon being so uncomfortable, some reconciliation of that hypocrisy, some turn to a genuine progressive stance might be possible, Ambassador?
Thank you. Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to reiterate that the values embedded in our Constitution continue to inform our foreign policy. At the same time, we have interests, we have economic interests, we have social interests, we have trade interests as a country, and we pursue all these inclusively. The two are not mutually exclusive. There's no dichotomy between the values and interest and the manner in which we pursue them as a country. And insofar as reaching out to non-state actors, we have an active rolling annual public diplomacy program where our executive, our minister and deputy ministers interact with civil society, with international relations scholars, and indeed with the general public of South Africa. And I would like to invite you to visit the DICO website to check on that program. When is our minister visiting your community? And please make it a point to book your place in those discussions so that we can hear your voice and take it into consideration in the formulation of our foreign policy. I thank you.
The anti-apartheid movement connected people of conscience throughout the world, and the new South Africa began as a global beacon for human rights. Have we ditched our principles to make friends? Can civil society influence our policymakers to ensure that we restore human rights as the core of our international relations? You decide. From me, Masachaba Ndlovu, thank you for watching The Big Debate.